Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. We've already started our discussion on the real understanding of Arabic and the way it is used while we make statements. I introduced you to the two ideas of harakat, which is the plural of haraka, and I mentioned that these are vowels, and the other is the concept of Arab that I introduced in the previous sessions. And I mentioned that this is something which is peculiar to Arabic language, not in the sense that there aren't any other equivalent, similar concepts in other languages, but in the manner they manifest themselves in the form of their peculiar formation, appearance that we see. And then we talked about the different changes that take place in a noun when they are in the form of rafa or nasab or jar. These Arab are referred to as cases, and we talked about the manner these cases change their appearance if they are singular, masculine, two double masculine, plural masculine, singular feminine, double feminine, and plural feminine. Now, these forms, we had started talking about rafa. This rafa or rafun is the nominative case, if you like. I didn't mention in the earlier presentation, but if some of you are familiar with these expressions and can understand them, well, why not? I mentioned the fact that when a noun, and right now we are talking about nouns, when a noun appears in a sentence, it has to take the form of any one of the three Arab cases. It has to be either in the form of rafa, which we are discussing, which is the nominative case, or it can take the form of nasab, and it can take the form of jar. This is raf'un, this is nasab, and this is jar. Double R is actually representing the tashdid on R, which is obviously repeating R. Nasab is described as accusative case, the Arab of nasab, which has a dot for noon here as well. And then we have jar, which is the genitive case, if you are comfortable with the equivalents in English grammar for it. But the more important thing is that we ought to know when a certain noun, the very same noun, the same meanings, when it appears in a sentence in Arabic language, sometimes it would take the form of rafa, sometimes the form of nasab, and sometimes the form of jar. And even though the meanings of the word would not change, the role of the word in a sentence would change, and it would help substantially for the reader, for the listener, to understand what its role in the sentence is. Now, we've already talked about two different reasons why a noun would appear in the form of rafa, why it would take the nominative case. And I talked about them as the reasons were mubtada and khabar. And to start with, I mentioned that this is the starter, the beginner, and this is the information, the news, which put together would form a complete sentence. This obviously, if you want to give it a technical equivalent, the mubtada is inquative, in a sentence where you don't have any verbs. The mubtada, the starter, is inquative, and the khabar is the enunciative. If it helps you in understanding. The idea is that if you have a sentence which is, as I mentioned earlier, is jumla ismiya khabariya, it's a sentence which has a noun with an information, a news about it. You do not have any verbs in it. And the statement will have two components. The first component is going to be mubtada, which is the starter, the inquative, and the khabar, which is the news, which is the enunciative. Both come together, both take the rafa form, and put together, they complete the sentence. So I gave you the example, if you kindly recall, the example of al-bayt jadid. That is mubtada al-bayt and jadid is the khabar. Bayt means house, al-bayt means the house, jadid means new, and put together would mean the house is new. And I said it could very much mean the house was new, or the house shell will be new. It has no past, present, or future tense. It's meant for all three possibilities, and it all depends on the context of the statement that would decide as to whether al-baytu jadidun means the house was new, the house is new, or the house shall be new. The only thing is that when it's not normally decided as to which of the three possibilities it belongs to, it's just normally by default is used in the present tense. So these are the two of the four possibilities that I mentioned the other day, wherein a particular noun, when it appears in the sentence, Arabic sentence, it takes the case of rafa. Now, we will move on to the next two possibilities, which are the file and naib file. So, discussing about the Arab raf'un, we talked about the fact that it has four reasons why there is rafa on a statement: mubtada, khabar, file, and naib file. We have done this and we have done this. Well, actually, in fact, both were taken care of in one example. Now let's move on to file. Now, when we talk about file, we've got to talk about the other category of sentence, which is jumla failure khabariya. Jumla, the sentence, failure which has a verb and it gives information about the verb, khabariya. Now, when you talk about the verb, obviously you use a verb and you have to have somebody doing that verb. So, you know, for example, you have this verb dharaba. If we write it in the English letters, it would be dharaba. That would be the transliteration. The dot underneath D is representing Zuad, Dharaba. Now, this Dharaba is followed by, for example, a noun, Zaid. Now, the noun Zaid is the noun mentioning the one who is doing it. The verb is Dharaba, the noun is Zaid, and Zaid is the doer, the one who is doing it, which we call the subject. So whenever in an Arabic sentence there is a verb followed by or at times preceded by a noun which has a rafa on it, which is in the rafa form, you know, it's going to be always the file, the doer, the subject of it. So nominative case, rafa, along with, well, preceded by or succeeded by a verb, and you be absolutely sure that it's something that has got to do with the verb, and the verb is the doer. Zaid, the doer, the subject of the verb dharaba, will always be in the Arabi form of rafa. And that is what is important. We then follow it up with another noun, which is Khalid, for example. Dharaba means he beat up. Zaidun, Zaid. So Zaid beat up whom? He beat up Khalid. Khalid is going to be in the nasab form, which right now we are not discussing. But what I'm trying to clarify is that whenever you have a verb and whenever you have subject, a file, the doer, the file has to be in the Arabic form of rafa, which is the nominative case. Let's take another example. Let's say in the Quran, for example, you have qatala. This is another verb. Look at the similarity. Dharaba, qatala. Almost the same, except for obviously the differences in the letters, the alphabets, but it's the same formation. He beat up, he killed. Qatala Daudu. Daud killed Jaluta. Jalut, Goliath. Here again, you find that in Daud we have the same rafa, the Arab of rafa, which is the nominative case. Whereas in Jalut, like in the case of Khalid, who is the object, the one got killed, the one got beaten up, you have nasab, which is the accusative case. You might have this question in your mind. Why is it that even though Daud doesn't have an alif lam, and yet towards the end it has only one haraka, not tanween. It isn't Daudun like it's in Zaidun. Normally, the case is that if you have a noun which has at the beginning of it an alif lam, then the noun cannot have tanween, the double harakat. But if it doesn't have an alif lam to begin with, then it normally has to have a tanween. Not in this case. Why? We'll talk about it later. But the idea here is that whenever you have a verb and then you have in the sentence the doer of the verb, the subject, the doer has to be in the nominative form, has to be in the rafa form. It's the nominative case. Let's take just one more example before we move on to the next possibility of rafa. Let's say amana. He believed. Amana Rasul. The Quran says Amana Rasul. The Prophet believed. So the Prophet or Rasul has a rafa. It's a nominative case, and what you find is that there is only one and not two harakat, because there is an alif lam preceding Rasul. Just another example to just give you an understanding that a rafa form is there on a noun, no matter whether it's singular, double, or plural. It's rafa form nonetheless, whenever it is in the category of status of subject. Let's say jahada, which really means he did jihad. And who did jihad? Many Muslim men. Jahadal Muslimuna. Many Muslim men did jihad. Now, what I'm trying to show is that the verb is jahada, and the doer of the verb, the subject, is many Muslim men. Now recall that when Muslimun, alimun, they are in rafa form and they are in plural masculine category, then they have an una added, alimuna. So here we have al-muslimuna, which is added to al-muslim to signify that the noun is in rafa form, and this rafa form or nominative case is because it's the subject. Now you might have a question, some of you, if you already know a bit of Arabic, that jahada is singular and al-muslimun is plural. How come we do not have a verb which matches with al-muslimun's plural? Why is it not in the plural form? Well, it's a good question, but again, we'll take it up later when we talk more in detail about these matters. Now, last but not the least is the example of the fourth possibility of rafa. Why a noun would appear in the rafa form in an Arabic sentence in the nominative case is what we call naib file. Now, file we know is the doer, or what we have called the subject, but naib file is subject of the passive. Now, what it means is that when you have sentences expressed in a manner that there are verbs in them. Verbs can take two forms. Verbs could be active and verbs could be passive. So, for example, daraba is an active verb and qatala is an active verb too. However, we know that in all languages, including Arabic, English, etc., you've got passive verbs as well. So, if daraba means he beat up, the passive verb emerging from daraba is going to mean he was beaten up. And that passive verb is dhureba. He was beaten up. Qatala, qutila. That is the formation, that's the flow of a passive verb. Verbs in their active form can change depending upon what the verb is, in the manner they flow, in the manner they take harakat, and we'll talk more about them. However, when a verb takes the passive form, and right now I'm talking about the past tense, the form it takes is absolutely the same. It would always be qutila, dhureba, kufira, nuqila, nusira, always the same, which is a help, because at least we have something which is consistent and predictable. Now, the reason why we are talking about it is that we have the fourth possibility of the rafa, the i'rab of rafa, which is naib file, which I've mentioned is the subject of the passive. And let's take, for example, the earlier example of daraba Zaidun Khalidan. Zaid beat up Khalid. Zaid was the doer, file, the subject, and Khalid was the object, the one on whom the verb was done, who was at the receiving end of the whole threshing part, the beating act. Now, when it takes the passive form, daraba, it would become dhureba. And in the passive verb, the subject of the active verb is not under discussion. It's not there to be mentioned. So it just gets omitted. And you have the object, the maf'ul, which is the real subject matter. The one who is making this sentence, is speaking this sentence or writing it, actually wants to convey the fact that Khalid was beaten up. Who beat him up is not under discussion, is not relevant, is not something that the writer or the speaker wants to convey. So, dhureba Khalid, Khalid was beaten up. Now, Khalid, who is the maf'ul, the object in the active verb sentence, is actually the naib file, or the I call it the assistant or quasi file subject, but I have now a more technically correct equivalent, subject of the passive naib file. Now this is in rafa form. That's why we are discussing it. So whenever you will have a passive verb and there is a noun which is in the category of the subject of the passive, it will be in the form of rafa. So Khalid therefore is in the form of rafa. Take the other example that we did, qutila instead of qatala. Who was killed? Obviously Jalut, and you don't have to talk about Daud here at all. Qutila Jalut. Jalut was killed, and Jalut is in the form of rafa because Jalut is naib file, and naib file or subject of the passive is what always appears in rafa form or the nominative case. Now, this is the entire description of the rafa form or rafa i'rab, which are essentially four. Whenever they appear in a sentence, and you can pick and spot the fact that they are in the form of rafa, nominative case, you would know that there are only four and only four possibilities. They could either be muqtada, the starter, the inquisitive, or they can be khabar, the news, the information, which is the enunciative, or they can be a file, the doer, the subject, or they can be naib file, which is quasi subject or subject of the passive. It really comes in very handy because when you have that information, well, you can actually understand the role of a noun in the sentence, and it goes a long way in helping to make out what its role is. May the Almighty enable us to understand the language of His book properly, and as a consequence enable us to also understand the book more deeply and properly.